As we look at the arguments that people are making, one technique we can employ to try and figure out whether an argument is effective is to look at and analyze the rhetoric, to analyze the way in which an argument has been presented to its reader. One aspect we're going to want to look at then as we analyze the rhetoric is to look at the way in which persuasion is employed. So the way in which an author is attempting to persuade his or her audience. When we talk about persuasion, then, the important key idea is that we're worried not so much about what the author is doing, but what the author is attempting to elicit from the reader or the viewer. So we're concerned less about what is actually happening and more about what that author is doing to the reader, what the author is trying to get from his or her reader. When we talk about persuasion, we go back to Aristotle, so we're going back to the ancient Greeks. It would be nice to think that we've come up with things that are better and smarter since the ancient Greeks, since that's 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. Unfortunately, Aristotle put it down in a way that was clear and concise, and we haven't really added to it all that much since then. So since we're using Aristotle, we're going to go ahead and stick with his Greek terms for these things. So Aristotle basically said that a good argument should attempt to persuade the viewer or the reader in three different ways. Aristotle said that the argument should attempt to appeal to the viewer or the listener's sense of logic or logos, the sense of the viewer or reader's sense of character or ethos, and the viewer or the reader's sense of emotion or pathos. Logos, then, and we're going to again use these Greek terms both because they are the ones that Aristotle would have used and also because it helps us sound cool at parties. Logos, then, is the use of logic to appeal to the viewer. And while Aristotle would have said that all of the different forms of persuasion should be valued equally, that logos, ethos, and pathos are all equally valid, in American or Western argumentation, we at least say that we value logos the most. We at least say that a logical argument is ultimately the best or highest kind of argument. And while that's probably true in terms of our valuing in particularly an academic setting, as I go through some of the examples that I'm going to be going through, you'll probably see that logic in our everyday arguments plays kind of a very small role, unfortunately, maybe. So again, a logical argument is attempting to appeal to the logic of the viewer or the listener. So it's attempting to make the viewer or the listener see logic in the argument. The examples I'm going to be pulling from then are examples from advertising. Advertising is essentially a very simple argument: buy this product. It can seem more complex than that because it's usually targeted to a particular audience. So an argument that is effective or valid for one audience member may not be as effective for another audience member. So our first logical argument is an advertisement for a compact computer. Now, as we look at this compact computer ad, we'll see that right in the center of the screen is a great big explanation of price. That's essentially the biggest argument that's here. So if the viewer was to look at this and say, wow, that's a good deal, then the viewer's sense of logic would be satisfied. The other thing that's on this ad is a series of of features that this particular laptop has. So for example, it has a 10-inch dual scan screen. It's got amazing 16-bit audio with built-in dual speakers. It's got a standard of 8 megabytes of memory, but it can go as high as 72 megabytes. It has a 510 megabyte removable hard drive, a 75 megahertz Pentium processor, and if you upgrade it for $389, you can have a quad speed CD-ROM drive. Now, as we, in the more modern era, look at this computer ad, we probably see these features and we see this price, and we probably are saying, wow, that is a crazy expensive computer, especially for what's being offered. This is the kind of computer that you might potentially find in the e-recycling program. It's this kind of computer that if it's working and in good shape, you might find at a thrift store for maybe $10, and even then, you might be paying too much. But again, at the time, so for the audience that it was aimed at, the price that's presented here, this $28.99, must have seemed like a logical appeal. It must have seemed like this was a logical price to pay for something like this. Couple more examples. So here's a example of canned meats. And so the logical argument that's being made here is that there's convenience. You can have an easier meal if you buy these canned meats. There's also an argument about value. So within these cans of meat are little sacks of barbecue sauce. And my favorite part of this ad is this picture of the woman pulling out this sack of sauce from the can of meat. There's just all sorts of disgusting there. Now again, at the time that this was created, this may have been a logical appeal. I don't know that it's not logical now, but the inherent value of canned meat may be a less logical appeal now to us than it might have been at the time. Here's an advertisement for a television of the future. So the logic in this ad is that it's small. It's going to fit into a lot of places. Again, the size of this thing for a small black and white television is maybe a problematic appeal now, but at the time it would have been perhaps effective. It's also listing its price on here pretty prominently down in the text at $229.95. My guess is that a television of this sort would be significantly less expensive now. Final logical appeal here. This is a advertisement for a JBL graphic equalizer, and in the old days, we used to have to shape our sound with these graphic equalizers. And so you'll see that the logic here is both the picture itself, it shows these equalizers in these up and down positions, demonstrating the function that this equalizer is going to have. And also there's a huge amount of text at the bottom. So the text itself is something that the reader is expected to be willing to read through. And so there's all this information that's down there that the reader might find logically appealing. So I realize the logical appeals, maybe I'm stretching it a bit. They're maybe not as logical as they could be. So then we move into an ethos appeal. And ethos appeals, you'll notice that the beginning of that word, that ETH, it's the same root as we have for the word ethics. And an ethos appeal is an appeal to the reader or viewer's sense of trust or sense of character. And so with ethos appeals, we'll frequently see celebrity endorsements or endorsements of some sort. So for example, Michael Jordan was known as sort of the endorsement king for a while. And sometimes the sense of character or trust makes a lot of sense on a ethos appeal. So for example, Michael Jordan was someone who advertised for Nike brand. The Nike brand for Michael Jordan, that's a pretty clear character appeal. Michael Jordan, as a sports figure, would know whether or not a pair of basketball shoes was a good pair of basketball shoes, for example. And so Michael Jordan saying, buy my basketball shoes or buy these basketball shoes I endorse makes a lot of sense. It makes sense that he would know whether or not those basketball shoes are good shoes. Michael Jordan, though, also was advertising for McDonald's. And Michael Jordan, as a sports figure, saying, buy McDonald's, it's almost implying that McDonald's is going to be a healthy choice. And whatever you have to say about McDonald's, my guess is that at least 90s McDonald's was not a healthy choice. Michael Jordan also advertised for Ballpark hot dogs. He advertised for Rayovac batteries. He advertised for Sprint long distance, where you could call the Looney Tunes characters. Again, that sense of trust makes sense in some spots, but the sense of trust or character, buying into a product because Michael Jordan uses it, makes less sense on other appeals. In your own papers, when you bring an expert into a paper, you're using an ethos appeal or an ethos appeal. So, for example, if you were writing about whether or not a particular strategy for public health was an effective one, using what the Surgeon General has to say allows you to appeal to your viewers or your readers' sense of trust, because we would tend to trust what the Surgeon General might have to say about a health issue. And we can trust what the Surgeon General might be saying about a health issue without having a whole lot of explanation as to why the Surgeon General is saying that, because we expect the Surgeon General to be an expert on health. So here's a few examples from advertising. Trust Chef Boyardee ravioli because the chef knows and understands authentic Italian flavor. Maybe a little problematic. This is probably a pretty good ethos appeal. This is a Radio Shack ad from the 80s. And we've got Microsoft's Bill Gates saying that the Tandy computer is a great computer to run Microsoft Windows on, that they actually use the Tandy computer in order to design the initial versions of Windows. At this point in time, Radio Shack would probably absolutely love to get a Bill Gates endorsement of Radio Shack computers. But again, the reason why it's effective is that Bill Gates is somebody, whatever you think about Windows or you think about Bill Gates, he's somebody who probably knows a thing or two about computers. At least that's our sense. And so, for example, if I was to walk into a Best Buy and there's two computers in front of me that are both equally affordable to me, if the Best Buy employee says to me, hey, this computer, this one over here on the right, this is the one that Bill Gates uses, that to me would be an appeal. It would tend to say to me that this might be an even better computer than the one on the left. If Bill Gates is using it, he must know what a good computer is. Here's a smoking ad from the 40s. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. And so there's a couple of appeals in this. On the one hand, you've got this sense that if a doctor's smoking it, it must be kind of a professional person's cigarette. So if I were to buy Camels, that means I'm a professional person. There's sort of an implied appeal that if a doctor's doing it, it must be the healthier choice. They don't actually come out and say that, but that's implied here. Also at the bottom of this ad, in the bottom right, you'll see it says that Camels are costlier tobaccos. So usually we don't want to advertise that something costs more than something else. But with these tobaccos, with these cigarettes, Camel is trying to make the argument that by buying Camels, you're buying something that is a luxury item, that is a premium item. This whole T-zone is something that used to appear on a lot of cigarette ads, T for taste and T for throat. Before the advent of filters, one of the concerns frequently was whether there was going to be a lot of throat scratch on a cigarette. A pathos appeal, then, is an appeal to the viewer's emotions. So essentially, it's saying, buy into this argument, or take my argument and you will be happy, or buy into my argument or you will be sad in some way. So it's appealing to your sense of emotion as a viewer or a reader. So any advertisements that are trying to sell sex are going to ultimately be pathos appeals. Here's a advertisement for a Fiat, the second best shape in Italy. When we see images like this, when we see an advertisement that's trying to sell female sexuality, our initial assumption, I think, is that this must be aimed directly at men. And the argument then would be, if a man buys this Fiat, he can have this woman in some way. This woman comes with the Fiat. That argument, though, I think also the argument may be aimed at women as well. So sexualized images of women are sometimes aimed at women, as if to say, buy the Fiat and you can be this woman. In buying this car, you have this body too. You have this image too. And so it's not exactly clear which audience this is aimed at. This one's pretty clearly aimed at men. Men, buy this cologne and you can have a great big one of these. So the advertisement is not really subtle at all. Here's a Dodge street van advertisement. The thing that's interesting about this advertisement is that to try and kind of analyze it, we want to be thinking first about who buys a street van, aside from serial killers in movies. And so as I look at this advertisement, my initial impression is that, oh wow, this must be aimed at hippie dope smokers, right? So you've got the guy in the corner saying, hey, did you know that street van spelled backwards is Tiert's Nav? This guy over here is saying, I got these fat polyglass tires. Roger, put me in a street van and I'm not coming out. And on the surface, that feels like that might be who the audience is. But if I think about where I see this kind of van, a cargo van of this sort, so you notice that this is the kind of van that doesn't have windows in the back. This is not a family van. A family van would have windows through the back. It would clearly show a series of seats in the back. Essentially, this van in the 70s, when this is being advertised, this is the van that somebody who owns a painting company might buy. This is the van that a plumber might buy. This is the van that an electrician might have. This is a working person's van. And the other reason why I know that this is not aimed at hippie dope smokers is that hippie dope smokers don't have money. They don't have the money necessary to buy new vans at the Dodge dealership. The person who has that money, though, is probably a guy. This is looks like it's trying to appeal to guys. It's trying to appeal to Roger here. And so it's a guy who's a working guy, blue collar guy probably, working in as a painter, as a electrician, as a plumber, something along those lines, carpenter maybe, and does his work every day, works hard for his family. But if he buys this street van, he can have a little taste of that fun, carefree, free love lifestyle that he's not getting. Somehow buying this street van will allow him to think that he's going to have a little bit of that. This one's pretty clear. Buy Happy Boy margarine and you'll be happy. My guess is that Happy Boy here is probably died of a coronary at the age of 60. They say that margarine's like the worst stuff on earth for you. When I first moved into my house, it was a house that had been in a foreclosure situation, and there was margarine sitting out, and even the few rodents that had decided to come into the house left that margarine alone. One of the things we want to look at too is that we sometimes have ads that are or appeals that are hitting on a couple of things at once. So this is an advertisement for Nike. You can kind of see the Nike logo in the bottom corner. You'll see that there's not much here that really says Nike in and of itself. But what they're trying to do with this advertisement, you've probably seen some of the commercial ads for this as well, is basically saying Nike cares about women. They care about women being in sports. They care about girls being in sports. And so the appeal then, in some ways, is a pathos appeal. That the little girl's cute, so that means that you should buy Nikes. But it's also an ethos appeal. It's basically saying that because Nike cares, and you want to be the kind of person that buys into a company that cares, you should buy Nikes. Here's a Sears ad for Sears carpeting. And again, this idea that anytime you see a baby or a puppy in a commercial, it's a pathos appeal. But there's also this sense that if you trust Sears, whoever you're going to have put carpet in your house, you want it to be somebody who you're going to trust, because even a little baby of yours might be walking on this. And so buy the Sears carpet rather than another carpet because you trust Sears. So in the class, I've also posted some additional links to advertisements as YouTube links. Let me know if you have any questions.